Hey peeps, Bimetal Ammo, what is it and why care? I've seen a lot of confusion surrounding this issue, and I'd like to enlighten us all on the subject using science! Specifically with a scanning electron microscope with an energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy detector. So before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about ammo in general. Now of course, to be competitive in most any market, price will always be a huge, if not the biggest factor in the success of a product. So if we look at ammo, how can we make it cheaper? We can't get rid of any of the actual parts of the ammunition, the bullet, the case, the powder, or the primer. And there aren't many parts we can trim off either, since they have to be a specific size in order to work correctly. The only part I've seen that's really expendable is the back end of the bullet. The jacket doesn't actually have to cover that part, so some manufacturers leave the lead exposed here. But mainly, all we can do to reduce the overall cost of ammunition, besides labor, is to decrease the cost of the materials themselves. Well, how do we do that? We can look at the case first. It's made of brass, specifically an alloy known as cartridge brass, for obvious reasons, which is 70% copper and 30% zinc. Well, both copper and zinc are expensive and getting more expensive, especially copper. You could replace that whole case with steel or aluminum, both of which are cheaper than brass, thereby lowering the price of your ammunition. Now doing that, of course, makes the case a single-use item, unable to be reloaded and reused. But for 98% of gun owners out there, that's fine, and it's not a big deal. So get over it. Now we also have the bullet, usually made up of a lead core and a copper jacket. The lead part is already cheap, and there's no cheaper or better alternative, so we're stuck with lead. But the jacket is made of expensive copper. Some companies like Cellier and Belleau use cartridge brass in their jackets. Why is that? Zinc is cheaper than copper, so by replacing 30% of your jacket material with zinc, you've made things a little bit cheaper. But what if you want to put your jacket on a real copper crash diet? What would you make it out of? Well, that's where we get bimetal ammo. So what sort of bad things have we heard about bimetal ammo? Well, when I was a new shooter, I was at an indoor range and the guy behind the counter was telling me about how they banned wolf ammo and how people still try and sneak it in. He was telling me it was this really bad stuff because it was so crazy overpowered it was chewing up their steel backstops. And I thought, whoa, crazy, scary stuff. I'm keeping that away from my gun. But then I saw some ballistics data on wolf ammo from two different sources. It showed that they were very standard weight bullets traveling at pretty standard velocities. So I was wondering, how does a standard weight bullet traveling at a standard velocity end up chewing up steel backstops and getting banned from ranges? Bimetal jackets. So what is a bimetal jacket? I didn't know. So I took some ammunition from a bunch of different manufacturers, cut the bullets in half, polished them, and then looked at them in a scanning electron microscope. There we can see the lead core and the jacket, and we can use the energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy to determine what elements are present in our sample and where they are present. So here is a regular standard copper jacketed bullet. Lead here, copper here. Here's a bullet with a cartridge brass jacket, lead here, copper and zinc here. Now, here is a bimetal jacket. Now, before we even do anything with the EDS, we can see something different going on here with this jacket. It has two layers, a very thin copper layer here and a much thicker layer here that is iron, also known as steel. So bimetal ammo is thus labeled because the jacket is made up of two metal layers. Steel, which is way cheaper than copper or brass, and a super thin coating of copper to prevent corrosion of the steel jacket. So how thin is this copper coating? Well, I looked at 5 different kinds of bimetal ammo, and the copper thickness all ended up to be around 20 to 30 micrometers. Okay, so how thick is that? Well, there are 1,000 micrometers in a millimeter, and the hair on your head is usually between 50 and 100 micrometers thick. So 20 micrometers is pretty thin. Upon this startling revelation that bimetal ammo is basically steel jacketed, the question you probably have is, does the rifling in the barrel of your gun dig all the way through that super thin copper layer and come into contact with the steel part of the jacket as the bullet is fired? Well, using more science, I was able to find that out as well. I took some guns to the range and fired some bimetal ammo into some wet newspaper, which allowed me to recover the bullets intact. I then cut those in half, polished them, and put them in a microscope to see what we could see. So here we can see the indentations left by the rifling of the gun's barrel, and very clearly we can see the copper layer is gone and the land part of the rifling was digging into the steel. And we can see it here, and here, And, well, basically everywhere. So in my tests with the guns I used, the rifling dug through that thin copper coating and dragged across the steel part of the jacket at 1,000 feet per second. We can see it pretty dramatically here if we look at the hole-fired bullet from the outside. Here's the mark from the rifling. Here's the copper. And showing through, we can see the steel. The question you should have right now is this bad for my gun? The answer is, I don't really know. I have my suspicions, but I can't quantify it without a few thousand rounds of ammo and a couple of barrels to test it on. Now, a few years ago, someone did shoot a couple of AR-15s with copper-jacketed and bimetal ammo until the barrels were completely smooth. But I believe that test was flawed in two ways. Number one, it's completely unnecessary to go through 10,000, 15,000, however many thousands of rounds they used for that test. Completely unnecessary. Number two, they didn't really determine the rate at which the barrels wore relative to one another. So it kind of really didn't tell us anything in any sort of quantitative, usable, real way, unfortunately. Now, actually, I have a better plan for testing if bimetal ammo is bad for your gun, and if so, how bad, but no one thus far has been interested in helping me out with those material costs so far. But I do have something interesting to throw at you about bimetal ammo. A guy sent me one of these a while back. This is an M2 ball bullet manufactured in 1952 during the Korean War. So it was most likely meant to be used in an M1 Garand or maybe an M1919 Browning machine gun. And it has a bimetal jacket. M2 ball ammo from 1952 is bimetal ammo. Now, there are two interesting things about this bimetal jacket. First is the copper layer actually has about 10% zinc in it, actually making it a brass layer. Second is that brass layer over the steel is about 80 to 90 micrometers thick. That's about 3 to 4 times thicker than any of the copper layers I found on any of the modern bimetal jackets. I can only speculate if that is thick enough to keep the rifling from digging into the steel. I don't know, maybe. One last thing is when I did this testing, I fired one bimetal round out of my CZ82, which has extremely subtle polygonal rifling. It almost looks like a smoothbore rifle. Barrel. But that round came out of the gun with all of the copper intact and no steel showing through in the microscope. I have something here that I think is super cool though. This is some Herter's TNJ ammo, which stands for Total Nylon Jacket. So obviously it's got an aluminum jacket, but it also has a nylon or plastic jacket over the lead bullet. And I think that's fantastic. There's no expensive copper or zinc in this entire round. And if all you're gonna do is use it for target practice, that's fantastic. That's great. I've shot it a bunch and I haven't experienced any issues with it in any of my guns, and I am not paid to say that. The other thing that strikes me about a nylon jacket is I suspect it might be a lot easier on the rifling of your barrel than any sort of metal jacket would be. Now, I can't quantify that either, but I think that would be a good comparison. Copper versus bimetal versus nylon jackets. Which is easiest on your barrel? Anyway, to wrap things up, I wrote an article on the subject which was published in Front Sight magazine a few years back. I have a link to the article in the description below. It has a bit more info on the testing methods and the bimetal manufacturers and blah, 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 blah stuff. So you can check it out if you want. Anyway, stay safe, have fun, kids.